The night was quiet, but the air was heavy with secrets, the kind that crawl along your spine and make your skin tighten without reason. Everyone believed they were safe, that the masks they wore were enough to protect them from the truths they had ignored. I had spent years learning how to move unseen, how to exist inside a family that measured worth through applause and proximity to superficial achievement. My sister, radiant and untouchable in her glow, didn't understand what I carried. She bragged about him, the fiancé, the hero. Every word she spoke built a pedestal, a story everyone wanted to believe, and I was supposed to sit quietly at its base. But some stories are not meant to remain untold. The small gray pin resting against my collar was harmless to the untrained eye. To him, it was a key, a flash of recognition that unspooled years of hidden truth in a single heartbeat. His gaze froze on it, his composure cracking in a way that was impossible to hide. He knew, he understood. And suddenly the narrative the room had rehearsed for decades shifted without warning. In that instant, silence became a weapon, and invisibility a shield. The laughter around us became irrelevant, hollow. Shadows on the wall seemed to lean in, listening. I realized then that the family I had returned to had never truly known me, and that the real story had just begun, one that would unravel the illusions they had built. Piece by piece, the room was alive with carefully curated stories, each laugh and compliment a note in a melody I had heard before. But I was no longer playing along. She positioned him as a hero, a man who had carried weight the rest of us couldn't imagine, and everyone nodded, eager to absorb the narrative she curated. But I carried my own truths, invisible threads that ran deeper than any tale she could tell. The pin on my collar was more than metal. It was a symbol, a silent declaration of what had survived the shadows, what had endured behind locked doors, encrypted files and whispered operations no one dared speak of. He shifted in his seat, the subtle tension of a man realizing that the world he thought he controlled was only a surface. His eyes flicked between me and her, tracing the space between perception and reality. And in that split second, everything changed. I could feel the pressure of recognition, the understanding that I had walked through fires he had only glimpsed from the other side of the battlefield. Laughter, chatter, clinking glasses, all of it faded into a background hum, irrelevant to the gravity of what was unfolding. And yet, no one else noticed. They could not. Only those trained to see beyond appearances would grasp the magnitude of the silent exchange occurring across the table. Every second stretched, every breath carried the weight of unspoken histories, forbidden operations, and the hidden calculus of lives that had intersected in ways no one at this dinner could comprehend. I smiled faintly, because this moment, invisible to most, was the moment power quietly shifted and control quietly returned to where it had always belonged. He didn't speak, not yet. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass, knuckles whitening, and I could see the battle waging beneath the surface between the man everyone thought they knew and the soldier who recognized truth when it stared him in the face. The room buzzed with polite conversation, but each word that reached me was a distraction, a veil over the reality that had already begun to fracture. The pin on my collar was no longer a detail. It was a warning, a challenge, a signal that the unspoken hierarchy had been disrupted. I watched him scan the room, calculating, measuring, aware that everything around him was illusion. His training, his instincts, the very essence of his survival, all of it screamed that the ordinary was never what it seemed. He had operated in chaos, navigated threats no one else could comprehend, and yet he was unprepared for me, for the quiet authority I carried without fanfare. He had survived battles that left others broken, yet the truth reflected in my eyes was a battlefield he had never expected. And then a small slip, a twitch in his jaw, a faltering laugh exposed the gravity of the recognition. He understood, and the fear that danced there wasn't for himself, but for the lies everyone else had built. The family's polished narratives, their endless celebrations of heroism, all collapsed under the weight of what I represented, a truth too sharp for their comfort, a reality too precise for their assumptions. Silence stretched. The invisible threads of control of deception began to unravel in slow, deliberate increments. By the end of the evening, nothing would be the same, and he, above all, would carry the knowledge of that transformation in ways no one else could comprehend. The way he looked at me now was different, no longer casual, no longer polite. It was the gaze of a man who suddenly recognized a force he had never anticipated, a presence that carried weight far beyond appearances. The room remained oblivious, filled with laughter and curated perfection, but between us, a current hummed, electric and precise. Every small movement he made, the way he adjusted his posture, the subtle hesitation in his voice, betrayed the recognition. The pin was more than decoration, and I was more than the quiet shadow in the corner. She continued to speak, praising him, curating his heroism, yet he no longer absorbed her narrative blindly. He was calculating, scanning for inconsistencies, measuring the distance between what had been told and what he now knew. My silence was deliberate, every word unspoken added to the pressure, a gravity that he could not escape. And yet I did not provoke, I merely existed. The embodiment of the truth he had spent years chasing from the other side of classified doors, encrypted operations, and nights that no one else remembered. This was the moment where masks began to slip. He realized that the stories around him were hollow, that the family's admiration was built on a fragile scaffold, and the pin, innocuous to the untrained eye, had become the fulcrum of revelation. He was silent, but his mind raced, parsing details, recognizing patterns, understanding that the quiet one at the edge of the room was the only person in it who had ever truly shaped outcomes that mattered. And in that tension, the unspoken agreement formed. The world would no longer be seen through illusions, and the dance of control had shifted, irreversibly, toward a truth they were not ready to acknowledge. Halfway through this revelation, pause and comment below. The shadow knows twice to seal your understanding and awaken the part of you that sees beyond masks. He shifted again, subtle, almost imperceptible. But I noticed the slightest tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes narrowed, tracking the pin like it carried the weight of lives lived in secret. He understood now that everything presented as heroism, as polished accomplishment, was only a surface. Behind it lay shadows, calculated moves, hidden truths the family could never comprehend. The pin was a key, a silent emblem of operations no one else could even imagine, a memory of nights that shaped destinies without ever appearing in reports or press releases. Every gesture he made, every half-word he spoke, betrayed the collision of past and present. I was not simply a quiet observer at the table. I was the ledger of consequences he had once relied on from a distance, the unseen hand that had preserved outcomes he thought were his alone to command. And now that ledger sat across from him, unblinking, calm, untouchable, radiating authority he could not ignore. His mind raced, connecting patterns no one else even saw, tracing decisions back to their roots, realizing that the foundations he had counted on were already shifted beneath him. The family continued, unaware, performing their roles with precision. She praised him, unaware that her every word only amplified the invisible tension, the acknowledgement of power she could neither measure nor contain. And he, the celebrated hero, realized the truth. He had been operating inside a system he barely understood, and the quiet shadow in the corner, the one he had underestimated, was the one holding the knowledge that could unravel it entirely. The air thickened, a subtle, almost imperceptible acknowledgement passed between us. He could no longer deny it, he knew. He had been caught in a reality far larger than the stories he had been told. His composure cracked further, imperceptibly at first, then in ways I could no longer ignore. Every polite smile, every carefully measured gesture betrayed the knowledge he carried, and the fear he could not speak aloud. The pin was no longer a detail. It was a summons, a reminder of debts unspoken, of operations executed in silence, of lives shaped by choices he thought invisible. He realized finally that I was not a part of the curated narrative. I was the authority lurking beneath it, the truth that could unravel the illusions he had counted on for years. The family continued their performance, oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring at the table. She laughed, she praised, she curated, but he no longer followed her cues. He was calculating, measuring, reassessing everything he had assumed about loyalty, competence, and survival. The room, warm and illuminated, became irrelevant, a stage whose audience had no awareness of the real power at play. He understood now that his heroism, lauded in stories and applause, was only a fragment of a larger pattern, one I had quietly controlled from behind screens, codes, and decisions he had never seen. And then a subtle acknowledgement passed between us, almost imperceptible, but heavy with consequence. He knew the silence I carried was not weakness, it was mastery. He understood, finally, that the quiet one in the corner, the one he had underestimated, was the only person at that table capable of shifting reality without anyone noticing. Fear and respect collided in his expression, a recognition of authority, of skill, of knowledge that had been invisible yet omnipresent. He could no longer pretend ignorance. The balance of power had shifted, quietly but irrevocably, and he knew it. The final moments at that table were electric with unspoken truths. He could no longer maintain the mask of the polished hero everyone celebrated. His gaze remained fixed on me, a mixture of recognition, fear, and awe. The pin, innocuous to the untrained eye, had become the lens through which reality was finally visible, exposing all the hidden layers of control, skill, and influence he had ignored. Every heroic story he had told, every act celebrated by family and friends, now felt fragile in the face of what he could not deny. I had been the unseen force guiding outcomes he thought were his own. The air itself seemed to shift, heavy with the weight of knowledge no one else could comprehend. She continued to smile, oblivious to the fracture in the narrative she had constructed, the gap between perception and truth widening by the second. And he, the man once exalted as fearless, now trembled in understanding. My silence had never been weakness. It had been authority honed and precise, a command invisible to the uninitiated, but impossible to ignore for those who had lived in the shadows. In that quiet, I realized that the real power was never the loud heroics, never the applause. It was the mastery of control, the unseen hand that shaped reality without needing validation. By the time the evening ended, nothing was the same. He had glimpsed the depth of truth, the hidden histories, and the danger of underestimating the quiet ones. And I knew, with certainty, that the balance had irrevocably shifted. He would carry the knowledge of that night forever, aware now that appearances are fragile, that heroism is often illusion, and that true power resides in those who operate unseen, unrecognized, but always in command. The story had changed, the lines of control had been redrawn, and the silent one at the edge of the room had emerged as the keeper of truth. As the lights dimmed and the last guest departed, the silence that followed was heavier than any applause. He walked away carrying more than recognition. He carried understanding, a knowledge of truths no one else could grasp. She remained unaware, trapped in her illusions, while I had stepped fully into the power of what I had always been, unseen, precise, unchallenged. The pin was more than metal. It was a symbol of authority, of secrets preserved, of lives shaped from the shadows. And that is the reality few will ever see. The quiet ones, the overlooked, the underestimated, they hold the power that defines outcomes, shapes destinies, and rewrites narratives. Appearances are a trap. Heroism is often a story told by those unwilling to confront the truth and the balance of control. It always favors those who move unseen, who understand the rules no one else even knows exist. The night ended not with laughter, but with revelation. He knew the truth. I had revealed it without a word spoken aloud, without drama, without spectacle. And the most dangerous part, he understood that from now on, nothing would ever be the same. The world is ruled not by those who claim glory, but by those who quietly command it, shaping reality from the edges, where no one dares to look.